since this is Veterans Day, I would like to recognize all our veterans. If you'd stand up, please. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your service. It's appreciated. And on behalf of Dr. Sue Ann Herford, I would like to introduce her. And do we have the lights? Sue Ann Herford. Dr. Sue Ann Herford is the Executive Director of the Heritage Museum, and she's responsible for all of this. So we appreciate you, Sue Ann. Let's give her a big hand. And at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, and I am going to introduce you Colonel James Ray. Colonel James Edward Ray was born August the 25th of 1941 in Longview, Texas. A 1959 graduate of Conroe High School, he attended Texas A&M University and graduated in 1964 with a degree in English. After graduation, he became an officer and a fighter pilot in the United States Air Force. He was stationed at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base in Thailand, where he flew an F-105 Thunderbird fighter bomber. After completing 10 extremely dangerous missions over North Vietnam, he was forced to eject during his 11th mission and was immediately captured. Ray spent 6 years, 9 months, and 4 days as a POW in North Vietnam and was held in several prison camps, including the Hanoi Hilton. He was released on February the 12th, 1973, and was honored with a homecoming parade at Tiger Stadium in March. Colonel Ray was decorated for his resistance to his captors and for developing communication techniques to help his fellow prisoners resist. He received several awards for his service, including the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, Purple Heart, and Prisoner of War Medal. Ray retired at the rank of colonel on December the 31st, 1990, and it gives me great honor and pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Colonel James Ray.
Thank you. I appreciate that very kind introduction, and I thank the Heritage Museum of Montgomery County for sponsoring this event. The history of Montgomery County and our family's involvement with Conroe and Montgomery County began in 1954. As he said, I was born in Longview, but when I was about 13 years old, actually I was 12, turned 13 that summer, entered the 8th grade over at Travis Junior High School, which is over, at that time, the name Travis was on the school. It's over on the east side of the railroad tracks, just north of the old Hewlin Anderson Elementary School. I understand that landmark is a little bit difficult to find right now, and that the William B. Travis Junior High School that I moved into that year has undergone some name changes and some different changes in utilization. So I have to be careful what I say, otherwise I'm going to confuse you or I'm going to confuse myself. But when we moved to Conroe, some of my very first friends were met on the football practice field and playground behind that old William B. Travis Junior High School. And from the south entrance to that playground, you could go about 3 blocks to the south and found some friends down there. Pete Palmer's dad owned a service station there. Right behind that house was where Toby Powell and his brother Joe Tom and it was Baby Huey, one of those guys. Anyway, their mother had been I guess an LPN or a hospital manager for many years before a lot of the hospital activities transferred to the new hospital a little bit farther south of the Santa Fe Railroad track. But meeting Pete and Toby and Bumps Baylor and Butch Lawrence and a bunch of those guys were the very first friends that I knew, and it helped welcome me into Montgomery County. Some of the memorable teachers that I had who helped me develop capabilities in math and science and things that would enable me to handle an F-105 Thunder Chief airplane later on and to be qualified to carry nuclear weapons and so forth. And I guess I have to thank the church and some of the other leaders there, because when I was younger, if I misbehaved, I got spanked pretty regularly. I was a little mischievous. In fact, I was so mischievous, some people called it mischievous. But I think I got some of that from my dad. He was a little bit on the mischievous side too. But and he taught high school biology. How many of you had Mr. Frank Ray for high school biology? Well, I see a lot of arms waving in there. Well, I did too. And my sister and my brother also had him. But some of the teachers that I wanted to call out, you remember Hazel Briggs in junior high school? She was one tough lady, but she was very polite, but always energetic and very punctual and very insistent on high standards with mathematics. Similarly, in high school, Roy Keyes, teaching science, plane and solid geometry, trigonometry, calculus, pre-calculus, and those sorts of things. He was also one among a lot of really great teachers, but I wanted to highlight those and call those out. One other was Edith Reynolds. Her husband, James Reynolds, had been a Navy veteran in World War II in the Pacific. He had been captured and was a prisoner for a number of years, a prisoner of the Japanese. And during his tenure, he managed to keep notes and was able to get some of those notes on scraps of paper and hidden reminders and so forth, and bring them back, and had developed a manuscript of his time as a POW of the Japanese. We knew the Reynolds from church, First Baptist Church in Conroe, and when I learned about his experiences while I was still in high school, I asked them if I could see those, and I got a chance to read through those. Little did I know, this was kind of prepping me for some events later on when I was feeling pretty beat up, pretty down, pretty out. I would remember that what Red Reynolds went through in Japan, on Formosa, which is now Taiwan, and then later on up in Manchuria, where just the weather alone could be a life and death threat to survival. Fortunately, we didn't have to endure that, but we did endure a lot of other things in common, and that's isolation, a rarity of mail to and from families, not knowing health status and physical conditions. But I was always appreciative of the fact that some way or other the Lord intervened and introduced that little bit of a kind of a vaccination into me. So I will always be appreciative to James and Edith Reynolds for that. Another benefit of living in Conroe and Montgomery County. As I mentioned, Dad was the biology teacher, and as you know, he liked to use humor in his teaching. He liked to walk around the class and lecture and point out different exhibits and things in animal species in jars of chloroform or formaldehyde or something. And so, and he liked to, for example, he'd say, you know, dogwood trees are really beautiful when they're blooming and you see the flowers are really easy to recognize. But he said, if it's not blooming, how do you recognize a dogwood tree? By its bark. So another thing about my dad is that he enjoyed teasing and being teased. And I recall one day I was sitting in his class, and as you remember in the over in the now I'm going to confuse myself or some of you, on North Thompson Street, the high school that we went to after we left William B. Travis was called the Davy Crockett High School. I'm not sure if it has a different name or different function now, but anyway, that's where the biology lab was located, back there between the old high school building and the gymnasium. And they had these rows of lab tables with sinks and things where we could do experiments from time to time. And I was sitting on a chair about this size. It was a four-legged stool. It didn't have background on it, but I leaned back and actually tilted back on two legs and had my elbows on the lab table behind me. And I was sitting there listening to Dad, and that's listening, and I dozed off. Well, Daddy just keeps lecturing and so forth, and wanders all the way around the opposite side of the room, comes up from the back, and he kicks the chair leg. And all of a sudden, I'm wide awake with my elbows and my imagination. And Daddy said, "Son, don't your parents make you go to bed early enough to get enough sleep that you can stay awake in class?" Of course, my classmates got a big kick out of that. But that was an example of his sense of humor and his way of teaching and motivating people to behave themselves. Some of the early jobs that I got, that some of which related directly and some indirectly to my future career at Texas A&M and in the Air Force. One of the very first ones was with Whitson Etheridge. Many of y'all know Whitson. He's been active with the Historical Commission and with a lot of civic activities, and with the First Baptist Church in Conroe. And his daughter, Anne Marie, and the kids, they lived about 2 blocks from where we lived. And so we knew them from church. And one of my first jobs was surveying with him, trimming lot lines and making sure that property corners were in the right place and getting used to surveying. Well, that influenced me to want to study surveying. And so when I went to Texas A&M, I began at first to study civil engineering. Another job that I had early on was with Bob Shaw at the Western Auto. Now, the Western Auto was on this corner right over here from the Crichton Theater, past the pool hall, and I think one other business. It was right on the corner. And my job was helping to sell Christmas items and to put together tricycles, bicycles, and some appliances that needed a little bit of assembly, and delivering those to customers. So I learned a lot about retailing, and sometimes he would leave the store and leave me in charge of the store. So I had to learn how to use a cash register and how to make change in my head, and a lot of things like that were very useful to me. as a matter of fact, I think the Shaw's daughter's with us here today. His daughter or granddaughter? It's their daughter. So anyway, I always appreciated that. Another job that directly affected my career in the Air Force was with a Mr. Ross with the Agricultural Stabilization Commission. Back in those, well, and still today, some of these things go on, in order to prevent farmers from accidentally overproducing crops, and with an overabundance, you know, supply and demand sometimes drives the prices down so far that people just can't make any money farming. So they had these crop stabilization programs where farmers who had a history of producing certain key cash crops like cotton, peanuts, wheat, and a few others were on the list, would sign up for these programs to help stabilize the prices and preserve the incomes and the livelihoods of the farmers. We would go out and measure those acreages, another type of surveying, but we would use big maps that were aerial photographs taken from about 10,000 feet, and it displayed 4 square miles. And so we would go out in the field, take our notes, do our measures, find that spot on the map itself, draw it out, take it back to the office, and they could run a little machine called a planimeter around it and figure out exactly how much acreage they had. If they had planted a little too much, we'd go back and tell them they got to cull a little bit of that out. But we'd always point out the hillside that had clay on it or the gully and said, why don't you take that out of production, because you're not going to make much out of that anyway. So that was a very interesting job. But the key to my Air Force career was being able to put things that a camera, a picture taken from 10,000 feet, where my office would be later on, and relate it to what was actually on the ground. So that really gave me a leg up when I was at pilot training in both the T-37 and T-38 trainers at Vance Air Force Base, and later in the F-105 Thunder Chief, when it came to identifying and attacking and bombing or strafing or doing whatever we were directed to do from our Air Force planes. Another one I want to mention is Mr. B.W. Cooper. Later in my senior year at high school, and then my years in studying civil engineering for 2 years, I worked for the Texas Highway Department. And I was a student engineer, and one of my first jobs was measuring and staking, putting stakes in the ground, which was the center line control for Interstate 45. And the location was right in front of where the library is now. So when you see where I-45 crosses the railroad, and the road is at 2854 to Montgomery, when you see where that crosses a little creek, back in the day in 59 and 60 and 61, that's where the old city dump used to be. And I remember how bad it smelled when we were cutting the lines through there and driving those stakes, but that became the control line for Interstate 45. And it also was a direct link to my studies at Texas A&M in civil engineering, which I pursued for about two and a half years at Texas A&M. Now, when I joined the Cadet Corps over there, I did so because my dad was an Aggie. My mom's brother, Uncle Bob Macklin, was an Aggie. Several of my cousins, had a lot of friends that were Aggies. But when I went over there as a fish and had to endure some quite a bit of harassment, sometimes some over abuse from some of the upperclassmen, I wasn't sure that was such a good idea, but as I got used to it and we learned how to counteract some of the things that they would do, for example, if some of the sophomores would be a little overzealous and even breaking some of the university laws, you didn't want to necessarily rat them out or get them in trouble formally. But if you could put the word out that if they didn't back off, there would be some consequences to pay, and then occasionally there had to be some consequences. So Earl Henderson and I, once I decided that the two guys right across the hall from me had done way too much for way too long. So we decided we were going to balloon water bomb. And the way you do this is you take a balloon and you fill it with very warm water, well, almost hot at first because it's going to be a while before you put it in place. But then you tie a knot in the end of the balloon and you let it set for maybe a half an hour or an hour, so that when you untie that knot, it's still so pinched that it holds the water. When you're ready to untie the knot, you sneak into their room. If they've left their door unlocked, and many times they did, because that's before air conditioning. A lot of times all the doors in the hallways were open and the windows were open. So you sneak in and lay the balloon, and it's warm so they don't feel it. By this time it's just about body temperature. You lay it in there, and then you go back to your room and you lie down and you take deep breaths, so that when the thing goes off and they know they've been had and they come looking, heard our door fly open, the covers came back, the guy put his hand on my heart, and we anticipated that. And so we made some comments about the certain community, certain behavior and so forth, which at that time was not very complimentary. And so by that time we had calmed down enough that they didn't catch us. They couldn't prove that it was us. Plus, they didn't think that we would be so bold as to attack the guys right across the hall from us. But we did. We got away with it, and they backed off. So this is, and I tell you this story, number one, because it's not uncommon in Aggie land. There were other things like using a cigarette as a fuse for a firecracker that you might put in a little bag of flour or in a can of Babo, called a Babo bomb. And sometimes if somebody had been very abusive as an upperclassman, you could use your cigarette. You'd have to be very careful about wind currents, where you place it and how you get away, and give yourself plenty of time to escape. But we had checked with one of the upperclassmen and had asked him if we could be in really bad trouble with the school if we retaliated, and he concurred that some of these sophomores were a little out of hand. But his key to us, which we took as not a green light, but maybe a flashing yellow light, was, he said, "Not if you don't get caught." So this became useful to me in Hanoi, as I'll relate a little bit later. Now, let's see. Later in my career at A&M, going through the Air Force ROTC, this is what led to my commission as an officer. And I had applied for pilot training, and all of the early preliminary testing had indicated that I was qualified. So I got a chance to fly Cessna C-120 and C-140 aircraft at Easterwood Airport in College Station. And before I finished my junior year, I had a private pilot's license. So that completed one of the criteria and cleared the way for me to go on, not only to get a commission in the U.S. Air Force, but to do so as a pilot and get an assignment to pilot training when I graduated in January of 1964. Well, some of you say, well, you were in the class of 63. Well, when I changed majors from civil engineering to liberal arts, with a major in English and a minor in history. Uh, Too long a story to tell about why, but I did that, and it caused me to go an extra semester. And so I had the fall semester to take some of the courses, like in math and science and engineering and so forth, that liberal arts didn't need. I had to fulfill some other obligations. So that's why I graduated in January of '64. But that also gave me an opportunity in the summer of 1963 to go to Uganda with a project called Operation Crossroads and build with a team of 13 other college students and an adult supervisor to help build a dormitory for a mission hospital in the southwest corner of Uganda. So that gave me that opportunity in career broadening and sort of it was kind of a trial missionary activity. That was one of the things that was kind of motivating me when I was younger. I didn't know whether to become a preacher or a missionary or a teacher or a detective. Always came up on the on the aptitude tests and so forth. But anyway, I wrestled with that, and I say wrestled and wrestled. Wrestle is East Texas. That's cut shoot language. But I wrestled with that. But speaking of history of Montgomery County, you know, Roy Harris made quite an impact on the history of Montgomery County. And his sister Frances was in our class, 59. His brother, Little Henry, was a year older, and I played football and basketball with him. And so I knew the Harris clan quite well, and I appreciate the service that Roy did to the county after his prize fight in, was that 58 or 59? And he spent many years as the county clerk of Montgomery County. So that contributed to the history and the development of Conroe and Montgomery County. But now back to my graduation and my pilot or my commission. I was assigned to Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma and was checked out in the T-37 and T-38 aircraft, and then did well enough in those classes, partly because of what I mentioned earlier, my studies in engineering and surveying and recognizing air-to-ground symbols. I did very well in pilot training and got my first choice assignment at Nellis, and that was to an F-105 fighter bomber. And went to Nellis that year. Nellis Air Force Base is in Las Vegas, Nevada. And checked out, went to a survival school that year, and then went to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina to complete all of my tactical qualifications. Nellis had prepared me to fly the airplane. Seymour Johnson helped finish any qualifications that needed beefing up, any of the training standards I needed to meet to be combat ready. And I got that finished by February of '66. Got my pilot's wings in May of '65. Checked out in the F-105, got my combat qualifications, and by February of '66, I was combat ready and volunteered to go to Vietnam. And within another 5 or 6 weeks, I was at Korat Air Base in Thailand, flying the F-105D Thunder Chief. Now the D model, single seat, single engine, fully loaded. The plane weighs about 50,000 pounds. Sometimes with that single engine, even though it's big and powerful with an afterburner on it, sometimes on a hot day and heavily loaded, it'd take you about 6,000 or 7,000 feet. That's almost a mile and a half to get your speed up to over 200 knots, 200, a little over 200 miles an hour, just to take off. And it's a big airplane. Sometimes when in a lighter moment, somebody asked me what I did, I'd say I was a heavy equipment operator. So, but during my first several weeks at Korat, I began flying combat missions along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And if you remember your history, Russia and China were both allies of North Vietnam. Our ally was in South Vietnam. And supplies would come in usually through China because they physically had to cross those borders or come in by air or by ship to one of the naval bases, naval ports. Our job was to interdict or to slow down that flow of supplies to help our allies with the war effort in Vietnam. So we would fly up there, try to destroy bridges, or would attack warehouses, or petroleum and oil and fuel supplies, anything that would help our allies with the war effort. Now, the day that I went, that was the key day in history for me, was the 8th of May of 1966. It was a Sunday that year, and it was Mother's Day. Not so fortunate, especially not a good day not to come back from a mission. But our mission that day was to hit a target that was up northeast of Hanoi, and it was very close to the buffer zone with China. We had a buffer zone up there because the U.S. did, in strategic planning, they did not want China to ever enter that war the way they had done in Korea. If you remember your history back in the early 1950s, as we were supporting our allies in South Korea, we got up to the point where we provoked China into coming into that war, and they almost pushed us off the peninsula. We had a perimeter at Pusan, and were able to fight back up to the 38th parallel. And that today is still the stalemate in that war. The war in Korea has never formally ended. There's still an armistice there. Anyway, in South Vietnam and in North Vietnam, we didn't want China to get involved that way. So there's a buffer zone up there, and the targets between Hanoi and that buffer zone were limited, and the enemy didn't take them long to figure out they were limited, and it doesn't take very long to guess where. Then as a result, they're going to concentrate most of their anti-aircraft artillery, surface-to-air missiles, enemy, the MiG aircraft. And so that target that I was on up there was a dangerous one, and it got me that day. We flew out from Korat out over the southern part of North Vietnam to the Tonkin Gulf. We rendezvoused with the KC-135 tankers and air refueled. Got enough gas then to go up to our target. The plan was to hit the target, come back, hit the tankers again, so we'd have enough fuel to get back to the base in Thailand. And those round-trip missions sometimes could go 4.5, 5, 6 hours, especially if someone got shot down and had to be capped in order to help facilitate rescue. But in the area where I got hit, right over the target up there, close to the Chinese buffer zone, there was no chance of rescue unless I could get back out over the Tonkin Gulf and hope that a Navy asset could pick me up. But the plane didn't last that long, and so when after I came off the target, I'd been hit in a pop-up maneuver. We rolled in on the target and got the bombs off, but I got hit approaching the target. It didn't seem serious at first, so I continued as long as I had control of everything. And as I was, just before I released the bombs, I started to see some yellow caution lights and then occasional red caution light. As I pulled off the target, my first radio call was Bamboo 2's off hot, I've been hit. Now, first of all, radio communications had to be very short, succinct, and brief so you didn't clog the radio with a lot of chatter that would interfere with important calls. So when you say you're off hot, that means I had dropped my bombs, I'd completed the mission. And the flight lead acknowledged and maneuvered into a position where he could watch me. And as I was pulling off the target and getting my nose up, as soon as I began to relax back pressure on the stick, pulling out of the dive and started to turn back toward the Tonkin Gulf, the plane all of a sudden pitched forward violently and then up, and it's like a bronc ride. And so instinctively I hit what we call a paddle switch, and just in front of our control stick, it releases the stability augmentation system. And stability augmentation is a fancy word for power steering for airplanes. So, and as soon as I did that, I let everything go because the airplane can aerodynamically dampen out the problems to the point where I can smoothly regain control. If you try to help get out of any of these oscillations, sometimes you can get out of sequence and you can make it worse, and so that's the reason I had to go through that procedure. At that point, the lead calls, Bamboo 2, you're on fire, get out. He wasn't saying, hey, let's investigate the damage and how much farther you can go. He said, very first call, he said, get out. But I didn't have any fire or overheat warning lights at the time. Now, I figured all this out later. It takes a lot of time because it takes more time to tell this than it happened. From the time I got hit till the time I bailed out was no more than a minute or a minute and a half. So I didn't have much time to do a lot of systems analysis. But I did have, at one point I heard the light in saw the light in my landing gear handle, and the landing gear warning beeper came on, and that prompted me to check my hydraulic gauges. All three of the hydraulic systems were going down almost to zero, and that's why it was getting harder and harder to control the airplane. And so at that point, the flight lead called the third time, Bamboo 2, you're on fire, get out, get out, get out. And that's when I lifted the handle on my ejection seat, got positioned. When you lift the handle, it exposes the ejection trigger, and it blows the canopy out of the way. And the noise, it's already noisy in the cockpit of an F-105 or a Thud. When the canopy goes, it's even more noisy. And just before I pulled the trigger on the ejection seat, something that's insignificant but very memorable, as I was getting ready to punch out, I noticed my checklist came up, and it was just floating in the air, just like, and as I punched out, it was right in front of me. Well, how did that happen? Well, when you're flying in close formation, we call it fighting wing or anything where your flight lead is maneuvering a lot, you have to have positive control of the control stick. So you put a little forward trim in your stick so you don't ever get in kind of a null situation. You know, like when you're driving, sometimes older cars, there's a little spot in there where you don't really have as good a control. You don't want that to happen. So, but in my excitement of everything that was going on, I had a little more forward trim than I needed. So when I let go of the stick to eject, the plane started and the nose down maneuver. It created the zero gravity situation. When I punched pulled the trigger, I blacked out as I went up the rail and ejected from the airplane at probably around 450 to 500 miles an hour. The next thing I remember is I think I felt the shock of the parachute. That's about the time my brain caught up with what was going on, and I came to from the blackout, which is normal, and I thought, well, I'm conscious now, but why can't I see anything? So I reach up to check my oxygen mask and my visor, and I reach up and it's slick, and I think, oh, good grief! So I feel, and my oxygen mask is over here. When I hit the jet stream at that speed, something happened and my helmet turned 90 degrees. And trying to look out through the earphones didn't work. But I did get the mask off and the visor up, and I start pulling on the ears, and finally got it back the way it should be. And I looked up, I had a good shoot. Everything had worked automatically. I looked down, and I see I'm within maybe 15, 20, 30 seconds of hitting the ground. So I had to get rid of my my seat. I've already gotten rid of the seat, but there's a seat kit that stays with you that has a lot of your survival equipment in it. I had to get rid of that. It's on a lanyard, but it falls away from you. And got rid of that. I landed and rolled, and to make a long story very short, I put all of my escape and evasion techniques to good use for about 4.5 minutes. And then I was captured. And then that started the 6 years, 9 months, and 4 days that I was in North Vietnam. The first night I was taken to a military barracks. I had a bad gash on the back of my arm that took some bandaging. We did that at the very first little village we came to. But at that military barracks, they wanted information about what speeds we were flying, what kind of maneuvers, what weapons we were carrying, what our targets were that day, and what their targets were going to be. And if they wanted all kinds of military information. And I refused to go beyond name, rank, service number, and date of birth until I went through the first session with a rope torture. And the rope torture consists of taking a small diameter rope about the size of the binder's twine used in hay baling. Wrap it around the arms a couple of times, or 2 or 3 times maybe, to get a tourniquet effect. And then they squeeze your arms together and back and try to pull them as tight as they can. Eventually it causes the shoulders and the clavicles to separate. Feels like a knuckle popping with a very sharp, almost an electrical type pain. And then after the first minute or so, those go numb. All the surface nerves go numb. So you think, well, maybe I can hold out for a while. But the longer you hold out, the more intense, the deeper nerves become. And it's like your arms, your bones are in hot coals or scalding water. And that and the mental calculations, you know, how much of this can I take? How much of this should I take? Am I going to go delirious? Am I going to lose permanent use of my arms? All of this is going through. But when the guard came in the next time and opened the door, they would come in and they were taught to say one little phrase. It was like, you talk, you write, you be polite. And that was, I guess, all the English they had taught this guy. And I would say no until finally I just couldn't take it anymore. And finally said yes. And my cover story was that it was my first mission. I was a young guy. They're people of a comparable age, rank, and experience level. Were so incredibly poorly trained by our standards that seemed reasonable to them. So that at least stopped the torture. They put me on the truck to go to Hanoi, and as I was climbing up on the truck, my parachute was up there. In fact, they had to help me into the truck because my arms were useless. They were like waking up from a nap when your arms are asleep. They were like that for several hours. But I went up and fell into that parachute, and just before I dozed off, I noticed the first light of morning daylight over in the east. And so all of this process had gone on all night. So it was a rough introduction. The next day I was in Hanoi at probably by noon, and during that first week, all of the interrogations changed from tactical, military, and targeting type information to just pure propaganda. They wanted me to do a war crimes confession, write anti-war letters to Senator Fulbright and President Johnson and Secretary McNamara, and do a lot of things that I didn't want to do. Okay, if you do your math right, from Mother's Day on the 8th of May, Friday is the 13th. Friday the 13th, I went through the rope torture again because I wouldn't write the war crimes confession. Again, several hours, I don't know how long, minutes seem like hours and seconds seem like days sometimes when you're going through that. But ultimately you have to decide, is it better to pretend to give up while you still have some mental reserve, or is it better to hold out and continue to hold out? And maybe what we call, some of the guys that come back reporting they went off the deep end. They tried to hold out too long physically, got delirious, and they weren't sure what they had told them or what they hadn't told them. And so that's one of the calculations you have to make when you're under that kind of mental and physical duress. So this time my cover was I noticed that in their propaganda they had learned to speak English from British sources. And you know, in Britain there's certain words that are different, like trucks or lorries, and the hood of a car is a bonnet, and the trunk of a car is a boot, and rail carriages are carriages, where we'd say a rail car or a box car or a tank car. They call them carriages. So once they had outlined this thing that I had to write, and I had agreed to write it, anytime I had the chance to work in one of these British words or a British spelling, like the words that end in OR, like honor, color, valor, O-U-R, King James Version of the Bible, you know, okay, I would put those in there as indicators to sleepers to sabotage the propaganda effect once it got to American sources or wherever they wanted to portray the propaganda. So that was the way I had to counter that. Regardless of all that, I felt okay about what I'd had to give them, but I did felt badly about having to go beyond name, rank, service number, and date of birth. In this little cell block that I was finally put into in the Hanoi Hilton, my next door neighbor, it turned out, was a guy named James B. Stockdale. Jim Stockdale, as many of you may know, turned out to be the vice presidential candidate during Ross Perot's presidential campaign. He was a Navy, they called him CAG because he was the commander of a carrier air group on a Air Force carrier, aircraft carrier, Navy aircraft carrier. He taught me the TAP code. But in order to teach me the TAP code, we had to whisper first, and I told him about the problems I'd been through with the torture and things I'd had to do, and asked him, you know, how they could help me do better. And he said, "You've done as well as anybody has. Don't worry about it." He said, "Just eat anything they give you, no matter how bad it looks or tastes. Anything that may have some nutrition to it, eat it. Save your strength, rest up, and anytime something like that comes up in the future, and they did come up periodically, do your best and then make a judgment as to whether you're better off fighting them physically or mentally, and just do the best you can. Nobody's going to judge you badly for that. He said the main thing you got to learn now is the TAP code, and that is a matrix where you take the alphabet, you eliminate the letter K, or else you use J and K in the same box. It's 5 letters across: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z. And it's downright easy. First tap gets you to the row. The second series of taps gets you to the letter. And so if I tap, I've just said hi to you. So, and it gets more complicated, and then because of their divide and conquer determination, they would not let us contact anyone outside of our own cell. And as long as they had space available, you'd be kept in solitary confinement. If they got too many pilots and they couldn't do that, then they'd double you up. And usually the most junior guys were the ones that would be doubled up first. And then later, you might get a third or a fourth cellmate. But during the first few years, you were not allowed to talk to anyone in an adjacent room. But by using this TAP code and variations of it, and we were able to build and maintain communications and work with each other to continue to hold our organization together. The most important thing we had to do was to memorize the names of all of the confirmed living prisoners, because the communists in North Vietnam were not releasing that information to anyone. So as a self-protection exercise, we all had memory lists. When I first got my first memory list assignment from Bob Purcell, another F-105 pilot who'd been there about a year longer than I had, there were 80 names on the list. And you arrange them alphabetically, and every day part of what you would do to consume, you had a lot of time on your hands. Between tapping, you couldn't do that very often because you could only do that when it was safe. You had to watch the roving guards and time things, and on Saturdays and Sundays you could get more tapping, pass more information, but most of the time it was very difficult. But knowing the names and their state of health was critical. Another thing that was extremely helpful was your spiritual motivation. And a lot of people are asked, or frequently asked, what kept you going when things were bad and you were really feeling bad for yourself? Well, for me, it was stories like Red Reynolds. It was faith in God, faith in things that I'd learned as a young person in Sunday school, faith in our Constitution and our founding fathers, faith in our Declaration of Independence and why it is so special when it is compared to anything prior to that in history. My time's running out, but I want to share this one thing in closing, and then I want to remind you of two things in follow-up, because I didn't get a chance to cover as much as I wanted to. But the Heritage Museum has a series done by Gloria White, and her husband was the videographer on this. That's going to be released probably sometime within the next week or two. So if you want to know any additional details, you can look at that. It focuses a little bit more heavily on the things I covered today about influences here from Conroe and Montgomery County. The second series focuses more on the prison days, and it's on a series called American Warriors. American Warriors, if you type that in and put Colonel Jim Ray or Colonel James Ray, there's a 6-part series. It's a trailer and then 5 episodes. 3 of the episodes have already been released. One will be released in about a week or 2, and then another one's under development, maybe another week or 2. But those will be available to give more detail for those that are more interested in things that we did, like we did to the sophomores at A&M. We learned how to do some things like this with our captors from time to time, except in those cases, you definitely don't want to get caught because it could be life or death. I mean, literally it could. But the thing I want to mention about the faith in God, faith in the Judeo-Christian philosophy, faith in the words of Jesus. I'll say this: my first cellmate after I'd been in solitary confinement for about 3 months was a Mormon, Larry Chesley. We were together for about a year. Then our next cellmate was Bill Chudy. He's Episcopalian, Anglican Church of England, Church of the American version, the Anglican Episcopalian. Yeah, I got that right. Okay. The fourth roommate was Al Brudno, who's Jewish. So here you've got a Southern Baptist, a Mormon, an Episcopalian, and a Jew living in a room that's smaller than a lot of walk-in closets. And we lived that way for sometimes months and years at a time. But one of the things that we knew that we had in common was the Judeo-Christian heritage, the teachings of Jesus, especially when you apply them to secular situations in life. It just would make life so much easier. As Jesus said, I've come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. He didn't come to convict you of sin or make you feel guilty. He came to help us feel free of guilt and to be able to respect each other, love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, even love your enemies. And that's sometimes a tough thing to do. But especially appreciate the founding fathers in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s as our difficulties with England were developing, and as we developed the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, which didn't work well, and then the Constitution under which we live today. Those are the most important documents in the history of mankind other than the Bible. I'd say the Bible's number 1, Declaration of Independence number 2, the current Constitution's number 3. Why do I say that? Because in the Declaration of Independence, there are these words: we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That is why America is special. First time in history that had ever been done. Everything previous had been authoritarian, top down. It didn't matter whether it was a king or a military dictator or an aristocratic family or a group of judges or other oligarchs. Everything before our Declaration of Independence and our Constitution was centralized authority granting rights from time to time to the people. First time in history, the people declare that the consent of the governed is the basis for good government, and we put it into words, put it into actions. We defended it in the War of 1812, and we're still defending it today. That's what motivated us. My time's up. We're going a little bit over, but that's the main thing I want to leave with you is thank you, Conroe. Thank you, Montgomery County, for giving me opportunities to develop and go through these experiences. If you want to know more details about how we tricked the enemies in some cases, it wasn't always easy, but if you'll refer to the American Warrior series and to Gloria White's interview with the Heritage Museum of Montgomery County, you can hear more detail if you're interested. Before I close, I'll just ask this. Are there any questions or comments? Now, I know there is a group that wants to make some kind of a special presentation today. So with that, I'll close my comments and turn the podium back to Sue Ann.
Okay, this is Beverly Wallingwood and some ladies from the Golden Needles Quilt Guild, and they have a special gift for you, Colonel Jim.
Thank you. How are you?
Hi, I happen to be one of the lucky students. I moved here in 1968 when we moved to Conroe. I did have his father as a teacher and was very excited to know that he was released and came back to Conroe. I know dealing with his dad and his classroom, and we got to know about him without him even being around us. So I am a member of the Golden Needles Quilt Guild, and our organization was founded in 1987. And we give back to the community by making quilts, and we donate to Montgomery County charities such as a CPS. We also do the women's shelter. And one of our main things that we like to do is we like to give to our veterans. Every year we have a presentation at our guild, and we present anywhere from 25, and we've given as many as 60 quilts to Montgomery County vets. We also do other organizations. But we wanted to make sure, since Colonel Ray was here, that being a vet that was held captive, he needs a quilt made by our ladies with love to commemorate our care for him and his dad and his family and all that he has done with his service to our country. So we're going to give him this quilt.
Oh, thank you so much.
Actually, I think it's sideways, but yeah. But this is for him to enjoy and wrap himself and know Montgomery County loves him.
Thank you so much. In accepting this quilt, that reminds me of one very quick story. When our first winter in North Vietnam, Larry Chesley and I were really cold that winter. We both had a little bit of beriberi because of the cold and the lack of vitamins in our food. But one night I was muttering, I said we'd come through a particularly cold evening. Probably the temperatures were down in the high 20s or low 30s, and with no windows, no doors, the open air, cell blocks. I said to Larry, I said, if it gets any colder tonight, I think I'm gonna freeze to death. He says, if you do, can I have your blanket? So now I've got a blanket. If I get too cold, I've got a blanket. So that little gallows humor for you.
Well, thank you for your service.
Thank you. Thank you, ladies.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for remembering the veterans.
You're very welcome. So I was thinking, as I saw that beautiful quilt, that it's going to be great in your favorite lounge chair recliner that Robin and Ed
I was going to
gave you.
say, yeah, when I came back home in February of '73, Ed and Robin Bartholet gave me a Lazy Boy recliner in Aggie maroon color. I still have that. In fact, I took a nap in it yesterday. Thank you, Robin, and thank you.
So yesterday, I got out my bracelet. How many of you have one of these? Uh-huh. How many of you have it with you today? Very good, Carol Ann, you and me. So, anyway, we want to thank you very much. We want to thank you for your oral history interview with us. We want to thank you for your time with us today. You are a Conroe hero, and we love you.
Oh, well, thank you. Just do the best we can with what I have.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.